descent. Because the enemy's trying to create a what in your country? Yeah, something like a revolution. So all this is going on. They're doing these things because they can't win on the battlefield. So here's a dog with a gas mask, the horse gas mask. Better than not. How about that? But the thing is this. It didn't break the stalemate. It made war more horrible. Gas did cause some panic, but it did not break the stalemate. It just made everything worse. So how can I get the gas mask on? And then hot and miserable, uncomfortable, hard to breathe. But it is a terrifying weapon. What about a weapon of terror on civilians? They made the logical leap. In 1918, gas was used on civilians. And then in 1919, the plan was to attack all the industrialized region along the Rhine River, drop millions of tons or gallons of gas on them, panicking and killing civilians here. Can you imagine what mustard gas would do to untrained, unprepared civilians? Or phosgene gas? That was the Allied plan. The war ended, but the decision had been made. And because the Allies had decided to do it, that's why in 1940, when World War II began, there's British kids getting ready for the inevitable gas attack. And yes, you got to have a gas mask for a baby. You see the baby inside? And you have to constantly pump the air into through the filter. That was the plan. Now, fortunately, gas was not used that much in World War II. But once you make the logical leap that civilians are targets, we can use gas. Think about the other weapons. As technology changes, so you're already basically deciding we can use chemical and biological weapons. Or do you know what napalm is, which was invented in World War II? It is jelly gasoline that ignites as soon as it hits air. It ignites as soon as it hits air and burns until it runs out of fuel. Or even a more horrific firebomb incendiary called white phosphorus, which is kind of this white powder that as soon as it is exposed to oxygen, it burns. And it will burn as long as it has oxygen. You put water on it, and what does it do? It burns harder because there's oxygen in water. If it gets on you, it burns right through you until it runs out of fuel because there's oxygen all over your blood. It is an unbelievably horrific weapon. World War II. They started using mass bombing attacks on civilians. Gas, biological, chemical, fire bombs. It's just a tiny step to nuclear weapons on civilians. And all of those would be used in World War II. So as a weapon of terror. And immediately both sides decided to do it. Now they were kind of reluctant, partially because chemical weapons didn't work as well as they thought. But also you could get a horrific tattoo. Yeah, somebody had this tattoo of a German soldier with a gas mask. And what does that tattoo tell somebody about this person? What's that?
Probably just didn't know what it was.
Or what else? Yeah, off the bat. I bet that person liked it. Yeah, look at this. That is somebody to avoid, right? You have that tattoo. Good luck with that. I'm going to go over here now. 3 points, 4 points extra credit if you get this tattoo. 4 in your math class. Okay, with that. 2, a starvation blockade / unrestricted submarine warfare. So we'll get to the unrestricted submarine warfare in just a second. So starvation blockade. There have been blockades and sieges and starving people out forever, but never with the industrial might of a modern, technologically advanced country. And both sides realized what this could do. As trade became more global, there's more trade and all that going on. You're going to have, for example, Britain imported almost 80% of their food. So if the Germans can somehow cut this off, that's going to lead to mass starvation and knock Britain out of the war. Starvation, think about what that does in total war. Germany, it's 40%. That's still incredibly significant, but there's one more thing. Almost all of German fertilizer was imported. So it's one of those things you don't really take into account. But think about it. If you can't get fertilizer, crop yields go down dramatically in your own country. Most of their fertilizer came from the United States, Bolivia, or Peru. Bolivia and Peru have mountains of guano. You know what guano is? Does anyone not know? That's bird poop. I mean, literal mountains. And it's nitrates. Nitrates are also for high explosives. Germany had developed a way to get nitrogen out of the air just before the war. But they used almost all of that for high explosives. So this would really hurt their food. So the massive Royal Navy and soon when the United States came, they sent ships to blockade duty. Blockade here, 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 and here, to make sure food and supplies can't get into the Central Powers. And there's soon going to be mass starvation in Germany and Austria. The food priorities will go to the front. There's a terrible food distribution system in Germany. So there was food in the countryside, but it wasn't getting to the cities where there's going to be mass starvation. And then the winter of 1915, 1916 was really bad. Crop yields dropping because of bad fertilizer. That's going to lead to food riots all over Germany in 1916. Food riots. So here are the food riots. All of these places where there are food riots. Here is one in 1916 in Berlin. Here's a bakery. Rocks thrown through and bread was taken because they're rationing food, but people were literally starving. And Germany made a bunch of really stupid decisions too. Because wheat production and grain and potato and turnips and all that dropping in production, they decided, well, livestock is eating it all. So they killed almost all the livestock, thinking that would save food. Well, you can see what's going to happen. Their food production wasn't that high, and then what they're going to call the next winter, they called it the Turnip Winter. Because that's all they had, many people, and there's no protein. Foolish decision. Maybe cut back. I mean, yeah, so the summer of 1916, there's a lot of sausage, but there won't be in 1917. And so by 1918, this is another scene in Berlin. That's a horse who died. Just collapsed on the street of starvation, a delivery horse. And these are everybody just carving every piece of it. And this is the guts they poured out, or they cut out first. Trust me, everything will be gone. Everything. There won't be anything left. It's just a spot of blood. Because you can use the bones and boil it and get a little protein out of it. The guts will be gone. That gives you an idea of the extent of the starvation. We don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people starved to death, especially the young people and the elderly. And it was very much urban, especially in cities, just mass starvation. German estimates, and this is German estimates, it's probably a little high, but it's really high. From 88,000 in 1915 all the way to nearly 300,000 civilians starved to death in 1918, by 1918. So you just got to get hundreds of thousands starved. We just don't know how many. But here's what we got to get to. This is what we call the kids growing up in this era, the Starvation Generation. So kids who are born at the end of the previous decade, all the way to being born through this war, they're the ones who will be forever changed by lack of food and lack of protein, be stunted, be incapacitated. You have all kinds of problems after the war. These will be the 20 and 30-year-olds in the 1930s who will become avid Nazis. You think they didn't forget, or they wouldn't forget? You think they would forget? I know, I immediately said it the wrong way. Think they wouldn't forget? Of course they did, and they blamed the Allies for what happened to them. And the Allies kept the blockade going 6 months after the war to get started. Even though the war was over and Germany had admitted defeat. Why? To force them to sign the treaty. They're not going to forget this. Austria too, but really in Germany. And you can imagine how politicians in Germany after the war are going to use the starvation blockade. I bet you can think of one politician right now at the top of your head. Probably the first politician, unfortunately, you think of when you think of Germany. Walter Brüning, right? It's Brüning, correct? So, the Germans tried to counter with their blockade with submarines. They called Unterseeboats, or U-boats, submarines. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Their fleet couldn't blockade Britain, but if they could get submarines out, and they didn't have many submarines, and Britain had a lot better submarines, but if they could use that. Now the problem with this is, unrestricted means sinking ships without warning. So being submerged and using a torpedo to sink the ship when it's not ready, which could lead to horrific deaths amongst the crew. Now, civilized war, they come up with a number of rules for blockade. There are these series of conventions. They did it in the Netherlands at The Hague before the war. And they were trying to make war more civilized. And one of them was a blockade, which is an act of war. Blockades must stop a ship carrying contraband. So let's say a ship was coming here to Germany, a ship from an American-owned merchant. A Royal Navy vessel would stop it and search for any product that might help the German war effort. By the way, what goods would help the German war effort? Yeah, so they stop in every ship. And they must either be escorted to a port, so they can't go to Germany, or if they're going to be sunk, the crew must be allowed to get on lifeboats and so they can survive. Signal without warning doesn't do that. But if submarines surface, think how vulnerable a submarine is. Submarines don't have armor. Their armor, their protection has been being able to submerge. And the engines were so small back then, they got to be light. All it takes to stop a submarine is one hole. They have a hole and try to submerge, they keep submerging. I think you get the point. And so, if they surface to stop a ship, they're really vulnerable. And so in 1915, they started sinking without warning, unrestricted submarine warfare. So in 1915, they said any ships coming into this area, see where it's shaded, will be sunk, coming into Britain. Now, I add one more thing about this. Their ships are really short range, so it's basically here, here, and here. That's where they would try to come in. And they carried, these are really tiny submarines. They can only stay submerged for about 20 hours. They had kerosene or diesel engines, but you can't run an engine underwater. Where would the exhaust go? So they have batteries, but the batteries would run out of juice, and therefore they would have oxygen for about 20 hours. So they would just lay in wait, hoping a ship would come by. And they move really slow. They just have to sit there and kind of wait. Well, in May 1915, after they started sinking ships, you can see it right here. The Lusitania was sunk, a passenger liner. Now, it was a British ship. It was carrying some munitions, but it had over 1,300 people on board, civilians. Over 1,200 would be killed, literally in sight of the Irish coast. Bodies would wash up for days. Almost 200 Americans were on board too, American civilians on a British passenger liner. The Lusitania, you see it right there, was designed for speed. So it didn't have the watertight cabins, and so when the torpedo hit it, it went down just like a rock. Shocked everybody. Well, this infuriated the Americans. It showed what unrestricted submarine warfare really meant. The Germans pulled back. So this didn't bring the Americans into the war, but this would set the reputation for unrestricted submarine warfare, as this great cartoon shows. That's representing the Lusitania, and I love the submarine, and I love another use of culture. That's from 1915. But now sinking without warning, and those who will be killed because of it, that's going to become accepted. How long do you suppose it took for both sides to adopt unrestricted submarine warfare in World War II? Literally the day the war started. Both sides began it. And no country was more successful in unrestricted submarine warfare than the United States in World War II against the Japanese. So, number 3. You notice how all these are kind of indirectly or directly related to civilians. Bombing civilians from the air. What am I talking about? It's amazing though how much more energy I have by doing this now. Put your phone away. We're not going to look at the messages. Look at that time. Okay. I have a clock. Oh, I know all you math people. I've got to leave. Math people. Do yourself a challenge. Do it in base 6, not base 10. Impressive. Right? Right? That good idea? Yeah, I'm here for it. So, the Germans were first. They had been working on a rigid airship since the 1890s called a Zeppelin, named after the creator. And the first target would be, of course, sheep. You wipe out their population of sheep, and a country's civilization can't survive, and they must fall apart. Okay, for some reason, this picture makes me laugh so much. It's a picture of a Zeppelin. And they want to show the Zeppelin flying over the countryside. So they thought, well, we want something in it too. Oh, of course, sheep. So when I think of Zeppelins, I think sheep. It's not a blimp. It's not a balloon. It has a frame inside. You can get inside of it. It can carry cargo. It can carry within it cargo. It can carry passengers and bombs. They're massive. The German Zeppelins were anywhere from well over 200 feet all the way to 500 feet long. So imagine something bigger than a football field flying over. They had big bladders of some lighter than air gas inside, like big balloons, all inside here. And their supply of helium came from the US. The British blockade, they couldn't get the helium. But if you can pull nitrogen out of the air, what else can you pull out of the air? Do you see a problem with hydrogen? Can you imagine one of these things bigger than a football field filled with hydrogen? Can you think how easy it would be to hit it? And so they started using these to bomb Britain, and they had to do it at night. That was the only way. So here's the Zeppelin getting ready to leave, and this is a painting of British searchlights trying to find the Zeppelin at night. And so they started taking high-powered guns and using them as anti-aircraft guns. And then those same anti-aircraft guns, they would be used as anti-tank guns. It's kind of funny how that comes around. And they started bombing London. They were inaccurate. They couldn't hit anything, so they just would try to hit residential areas and increase the terror. Half the bombs were duds. This was all brand new. The crews on these Zeppelins were in complete misery, 12 to 15,000 feet, bitterly cold, no oxygen. And if they're hit, I think you know the problem. Yeah, they kind of crude parachutes, literally a blanket and a couple string and 4 ropes. Ah! I think you see the problem there. And so this is horrific for the crews, horrific for the for Britain, but it was just the randomness of it. And to give you an idea how random it was, I had a personal experience with this. So when Miles City was bombed by Zeppelin, so I was walking. I was in London. I was doing a walking tour. I really like walking tours. And there's this company called London Walks in London. There's my little advertisement for them. They do these walking tours. They're fantastic. And they're really good guides who know their history. So historical ones. I did one like a Jack the Ripper, went to all the places. That was really cool, actually. All kinds of great ones. We did a restaurant one, which I ate too much. This one was old English pubs and gaslight tours. They have still streets with gas lights instead of street lights. So you walk on these old streets and go to these old little, the pubs, but they're like restaurants. And so we're walking, it's really a cool tour. And the guy's talking to us, it's kind of like getting, like 6 o'clock, so there's still a little bit of light. He's talking to us, I'm listening, whatever. I just happened to kind of turn around and saw this. These premises were totally destroyed by a Zeppelin raid, just randomly there. 1915, rebuilt 1917. So I took a picture, just this building, just this random building was hit by a bomb. The other very random thing that I have no idea, there was a mini crackle candy bar, a little mini chocolate bar right there, just sitting next to the sign. I just thought that the randomness of that was very interesting. The bar was delicious. My advice for you is not to eat things picked up off the ground. I know some of you weren't sure. It's advice. It's not a rule. Okay, so, but you can imagine with technology changing, at first very crudely with airplanes. Here they are with almost comically looking bombs or grenades at first, but by 1917, using aluminum for parts of the plane to make it a little bit more durable. Aluminum, they're just learning new techniques to make aluminum. They're starting to have 2 and 4 engine bombers. And this British bomber right here, really rickety still, but could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs. And they could begin to bomb German cities. And that's a propaganda poster basically saying what England will do unless we win the war. And that's bombing German cities. And that was the plan, to bomb German cities. Take the war to them. And think about, we've already talked about gas to all these weapons, all the way to nuclear bombs. And one more thing about this. So the next war, after the initial kind of shock of it, when both sides realized this war is not going to end, the bombing of civilians became the norm. And it would start with the terror bombing of Warsaw by Germany in September 1939. On this date, in 1945, putting all of this together, the United States, using bases in the just recently recaptured island of Guam and the Japanese islands of Saipan and Tinian, in the Marianas Islands, they started bombing Japan. And it didn't work. It was a disaster. They couldn't hit the targets. It was all kinds of disaster. So on the night of March 8th and 9th of 1945, they switched tactics. Over 200 heavy B-29 bombers, brand new American bomber. They carried napalm and white phosphorus and bombed Tokyo at night. So this was just mass, they called it area bomb. They killed as many civilians as possible. And in one night, over 120,000 Japanese civilians were killed. On this day, 1945. And that would become the norm. So they would begin firebombing Japanese cities and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians every month for the rest of the war. Until they literally ran out of bombs. Then they wait till they build up bombs again and do it again. So when the United States used the atomic bomb, the only country to use atomic bombs, the US, Japan had already lost over 2 million civilians by firebombs. And the war was over. Japan was looking for a way to survive. Already looking for a way to quit. And we still dropped it. That's the logic of total war. Now, when I mean logic, I don't mean like that's a good or bad outcome. It's just the thinking process. This leads to this, leads to this. Okay, everyone talks about the atomic bombs, and they forget significantly more people were burned alive with firebombs. And so, speaking of fun of total war, let's get to the last one, genocide. Genocide, the first genocide. Now, there have been mass killings of people based upon all sorts of reasons. But this is where you have the power of the industrial state. It's, make sure you got the definition of this. State-sponsored, industrial murder of a group of people. Now, something to differentiate them from the rest of the population. Catch on. Like a different ethnic or national group, racial or religious group. Some kind of differentiation. Something where they're the other. They're not like us. Now, remember the logic of total war. You have an enemy within. They're trying to undermine it. They might revolt. And remember, total war, there can be no dissent. But what about a group that maybe you don't trust? A potential enemy within because they're different in some way. And that's what's going to happen in World War I. What country was this in World War I? Don't look at Turkey because it's not Turkey. What country? The Ottoman Empire. And this is the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian Genocide. So yeah, basics, right? See ya. What are they going into? All of a sudden they leave. Yeah. Well, I'm glad they're gone. Okay, so see you tomorrow. All right, so The Armenian population, now the Armenian, it fits all of these. It's an ethnic group. They're trying to get their own national identity as a country. You have this weird, these kind of fake racial groups, and they're different religion. Armenians lived in this area here. And there's a different language, a different ethnic group, and most of them were Christians in a majority Muslim country. And as there's a growing Turkish nationalism called the Young Turk movement, who began to look at them suspiciously before the war. But in 1914 and 1915, the Ottoman Empire invaded into here and were crushed and forced into headlong retreat. There's a huge Armenian population in Imperial Russia. The country of Armenia today is in the former Russian Empire and then former Soviet Union, right here. I know someone who teaches at an international school in Armenia right now. But they blame the Armenians for the defeat. They found a scapegoat. The Armenians are probably helping the Russian Armenians, and they're trying to overthrow our government. And so they began to round up Armenians, not based upon anything they did, but who they are, or who they perceived as somebody other than us that we can't trust. So they rounded them up into these concentration areas, and they began to move them. And along the way, along railroad lines, hundreds of thousands would be taken out and machine gunned, slaughtered. Those who survived were taken to concentration camps all along this area here. Remember concentration camps from the Cuban War, the Cuban Revolt? Remember that reconcentration policy? Where they were starved, murdered, hundreds of thousands were forced into the desert of what is now Iraq to die in the desert. We don't know how many were killed. Here are Armenians who had died, and some are almost certainly starved, some are machine gunned. So using all the powers of a modern, relatively modern state to be slaughtered. Here are Armenians marched off into the desert to die a horrific death. After the war, as Armenian relief, here are Armenians posing with the skulls of dead Armenians to try to get relief for those Armenians. I know it's so macabre, but that was to try to get help. And the Armenian Genocide would last until 1923, long after the war ended. It still went on. It would end in 23 in the western part of what is now Turkey, well, the modern country Turkey then. And people knew. Here's articles from the New York Times in 1915 through 1917. For example, 800,000 Armenians counted, destroyed. I mean, what a way to put it. Millions killed or in exile. Horrors done in Armenia. Now, I don't know what the United States or anybody could have done, but this would be a horrific slaughter. Here is an Ottoman official taunting, starving Armenian children with food. This was hell beyond belief, and it's amazing and frightening how people can just get so jaded that it doesn't even affect him anymore. The guy probably thought that was really funny. And we don't know how many, maybe between 1.5 to 3 million Armenians are going to be burned. Turkey to this day does not acknowledge it. They try to get into the European Union, and that's kind of on hold because Turkey will not acknowledge the genocide. They just won't even acknowledge it. And Germany was appalled, their ally. I know that's ironic, isn't it? Partially because of the humanity of it, partially because they need every person they can to win this war. But to tell you a little story about this, in 1938, so on the eve of World War II, Germany they know a total war is coming. Hitler wants war. There's a tiny population of Jews in Germany, and they have ramped up the persecution to force the Jews in Germany to leave. Just leave, get out, go. So they're forcing them to go. And some of Hitler's advisors were saying, this will make us look really bad. And we're not ready for war yet. They weren't ready at all in 1938 or 39 for war. And so maybe we should tone this down. They didn't care so much about the anti-Semitism and the persecution. Basically, things like taking away their legal rights, taking away their economic rights to force them to leave. And about half of the German Jews did leave before the war. There weren't very many. less than 1% of the population of German Jews. But Hitler responded with, of course I'm not going to quit. Why should I? Today, who remembers the Armenians? He said that in 1938. Now, I bet a lot of you have no idea about the Armenian Jews. I'm not criticizing you, that's why we're here. But this is a big deal. I know partially because there'll be many more genocides. I wish I didn't have to say that, but there's going to be. And the US is involved with things very close to this, just not on an industrial scale, like in the American West. But the genocide of Jews, which in the 1960s, the term the Holocaust would start coming out, the term you've all heard of, I'm sure. That's not German Jews. Those are Jews that Germany occupied, horrifically occupied, and we're worried about this enemy within. We're talking here. And what is at that time was Poland and the Soviet Union. That's the Jews that were murdered by Nazi Germany. Almost all of them lived here. Or today it's the Ukraine. I'm sorry for saying that. Every country that goes into total war will start persecuting other people. Every country. The United States did it to Japanese Americans in World War II. And I'll show you what they're going to do to German Americans. Not quite to this scale, but there were concentration camps in the United States. And so, with that, that's why total war, all these things lead to it. But while this is going on, the US is neutral. Peace and love. No, we're staying out of the war. When the war first began, there was initial economic downturn, but then the US started making lots of money. They started trading because you can imagine belligerents. Countries at war want everything. But why was, by the end of 1915, almost 99% of American trade to countries at war were to the Allies? Why? Why was almost all of American trade to the Allies? Yeah, the blockade. We couldn't trade with Germany. So you can imagine, to the German point of view, we're pretty much helping the Allies. Now, we didn't make a lot of munitions, but we made like nitrates. You need nitrates for fertilizer, but you need nitrates for high explosives. Steel, food. So many horses would come from the United States. It's hard to even imagine. So I grew up in Miles City. Miles City would be famous for a depot for horses. From all over eastern Montana, horses, and they'd be shipped east and then sent to Britain. They still celebrate that, even though people in Miles City don't know why, but people from all over eastern Montana go to Miles City for something called the Bucking Horse Sale, this big kind of party about it. And it was all from World War I, selling horses to the Allies. So here's the peace, we're neutral. Hey, you want your weapons? And the US economy was booming. Farm prices went up, everything went up. Here's one, though, the US is acting like we're opposed. Here's one of all the belligerent dogs, so like the Dachshund, the English Bulldog, the French Bulldog, the Belgian Wolfhound, which, by the way, Belgian Wolfhounds are really pretty dogs. I was going to tell you that. But here's an American Bull Terrier. Yeah. I am neutral, but not afraid of them. But the US stayed out. US had their own things going on in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't called basic diplomacy, but there was a civil war, which we always will call, you see it called the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. And the US is going to intervene. We want a government pro-American business, kind of basic diplomacy. Poor Mexico will go through this horrible 10-year struggle. Here are Zapatista revolutionaries in Yucatan. In 1914, the US, I put down intervene, but they sent in the Marines and occupied the harbor city of Veracruz. In 1916, 1917, the United States would chase the revolutionary Pancho Villa. Here's an actual wanted sign for him. And over 1,000 US cavalry were tramping around northern Mexico, fruitlessly chasing Pancho Villa. When the war began, when the US entered the war, we're in Mexico, 1,000 cavalry. Villa was a revolutionary, and he thought the Americans were helping his enemies. So he actually went into New Mexico and robbed a bank. Revolutionaries need money. So that's Villa. So the point is, eventually kind of a right-wing, conservative, oligarchical government would take over Mexico, be in power until the 1980s. The US is in Mexico, kind of a disaster when the war began. And there's an election that year. The election of 1916, the same year the US sent cavalry on this fruitless effort. It was foolish. But also, we invaded a country. 1916, Wilson's going to run for re-election. No Democrat had been elected for a second term, consecutive second term, since Andrew Jackson. Uncle Grover was elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. But Wilson, the Republican was Charles Evans Hughes of Massachusetts. There's Hughes. Wilson, you can see his slogan, he kept us out of the war. Wilson meant peace, and they really implied, look at the economy's doing great, there are some reforms, and we're out of the war. He meant peace. We increased the size of the army to 100,000 men, which is nothing compared to European numbers. So we're being realistic, but it's out of the war, and it worked. Wilson won a razor-thin election. In fact, he was elected and immediately said, I will broker a peace in Europe, which made the Europeans almost laugh. 4 months later, the US will be in the war. Why? Unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans rolled the die and decided to sink ships without warning. So just to review, 1915 they tried it, that was in Lusitania. 1916 they did partial unrestricted submarine warfare. Both times the Germans backed out. Both times they went back to surfacing and stopping ships out of it. Both times. I think you can see where this is going. Remember the battles of Verdun? Remember Verdun, the Somme? Both sides lost nearly 1 million casualties. Germany lost so many men. It was they're running out of men. They roll the die. The Kaiser picks 2 new generals to basically take over the country. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg would be the new commander of the entire German army, therefore the country. And his chief of staff, the guy who coined the term total war, Erich Ludendorff. There's Hindenburg, there's the Kaiser, there's Ludendorff. And they came in saying, we can knock Britain out of the war, starve them. What if we marshal our U-boats? And they're making better, longer range U-boats. Put all these resources in, hold them back, and then in January 1917, unleash the U-boats. And this is a propaganda poster from Britain showing U-boats, from Germany, U-boats surrounding Britain. We'll starve them out. That's the plan. We'll start sinking without warning. Now, America might enter the war. This is going to infuriate them. But Britain just needs a push, and they'll leave. So that's the plan. Now, this is a really desperate plan. And it's one of the great what-ifs in history. What if they would have just unleashed the U-boats, but still surface and sink them according to the rules of war? America might not have entered the war. And we literally have an unimaginably different course of history. I can't even wrap my mind around how things would be different. I mean, seriously, I have no idea. But they really thought we can do it now. And they had very unrealistic goals, as all isolated commanders do. Check Putin right now in Russia. And so this area right here is the area where they said any ships going in will be sunk. Now, their ships, the U-boats didn't have long enough range. So they're basically here and here. Orders to sink any ship, regardless of what flag they're flying. So American merchant companies, their ships are going to be sunk. British ships, Brazilian, I'm just giving up neutral countries, Argentina, they're all going to be sunk. Argentina was big because They were one of the biggest cattle producers in the world at that time. And this shows anger. U.S. broke off relations. And this was before the inauguration. The inauguration was in March. Wilson's furious. Well, at the same time, Britain is going to unleash something else. A few American ships are sunk, and then all of a sudden, Britain's going to go, oh yeah? Oh, so U.S. ships are going to be sunk. Here's a U.S. patient, and there's a submarine. The latest submarine victim may be the last. So this would be the #1 reason. Everyone got this for U.S. entering the war. But then the Zimmerman note. Britain showed the United States this telegram. Now, Zimmerman was the foreign minister to Germany, and he sent a telegram via Western Union, there's a copy of it, to the German ambassador in Mexico. And the German ambassador in Mexico was going to make a proposition. If the U.S. enters the war in Europe, Mexico should attack the U.S. So Mexico attacked the U.S. This is ridiculous. Mexico's in a civil war. They can't attack the United States, but Germany told them this. It's a dumb idea. Mexico laughed this off. And Germany said, you'll get back the Mexican cession. All the land between California and Colorado, it's back in. This is so stupid. Here's the code. See all the numbers here? That's the German code. They thought it was unbreakable. They didn't know that the British had broken their code 2 years earlier. Britain had broken their code. One of the great ironies is Britain broke Germany's code in World War II, too. Both of these would be decisive in winning the war. Both times Germany thought their code could never be broken. The United States broke the Japanese code. Big deal. And so, a few American ships are sunk. The U.S. is already angry. And then Britain said, and look what else. They're going to try to get Mexico to attack you. We consider this our hemisphere. The United States went nuts. You combine the Zimmerman note with ships being sunk with unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson resisted, a few other things, and then finally Wilson very reluctantly asked for a declaration of war, and Congress gave it to him. So the two biggest reasons, and we got that, the two biggest reasons, Zimmerman note, and then of course unrestricted submarine warfare. But then Wilson would say, we want a new world. In fact, he literally used the term, New World Order. And what he said was, we want to make the world safe for democracy. We just put down democracy. We want democracy. Now, this is really disingenuous. How many countries actually allow their adult population, all their adult population, to vote for elected officials? Did the United States? Absolutely not. Neither did Germany, neither did France, but we claimed it. And then the Tsar was overthrown in Russia, and they're going to create a republic. And so we could say, Russia's going to be a democracy. We're going to fight for them. There's 2 revolutions in Russia. So we're claiming we're fighting for a higher purpose, not just because we want commerce and money for the great trade we're getting. And what country did Germany take that was used for propaganda purposes? Poor little what? Belgium. They were still using Belgium. And on that happy note, so we're going to get into the quick American mobilization of war for war. When the war ends, it's going to happen so fast. By the way, I went into total war in great detail because that is so important. So when we get to World War II, I'm just going to say went to total war. And my expectation is you'll know. And total war changes everything. Now do you see why I wear a mask out in the hallway? Have a great, if anyone's going to be gone on Thursday and Friday, come see me real quick. I'm going to give you the documents for the DBQ.
No! I'm yelling at the computer.